welcome to Online for Authors. Today I am chatting with Kay Smith-Blum, author of Tangles. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you for having me, Terry. I'm looking forward to visiting.
I'm super excited to have you. Loved the book. But before we really get into things, I want you to give a quick little elevator pitch. When someone opens up this cover, what are they going to find?
Tangles is a love story wrapped inside a Cold War time period mystery. It's a very human story set against the backdrop of the nuclear arms race, which most people don't know very much about in our history. And within this process, you're going to learn a lot about nuclear waste and the havoc that has been created within the environment across the globe, but specifically at the Hanford nuclear site, which is in Eastern Washington, which is basically my backyard. I'm from Seattle.
Right. And so I'm a research junkie. I mean, that's just what I am. And so as I'm reading this, I did stop to find out, is this a made up place or is this a real place? And it was like, no, this is real. Okay. So I'm going to dive into that aspect of it. I'm assuming there was a lot of research that had to be done.
About 10 solid months of research, and I spoke with over probably 24 experts in various fields, whether it was nuclear science or whether it was historians or whether it was, workers or engineers,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. So a plethora of research.
Right. And so in addition to, you said 10 months of research, which is a lot of research for a book, guys. That's really delving in. What is your writing process like? Like, how long did it take you from the point you came up with this idea until you were ready to launch this novel?
So it was so interesting because the first 2 or 3 months I was exploring the idea of writing something about this time period in this particular location. And that came about because of a couple of conversations that I had with friends that I sort of vaguely knew were from the Tri-Cities, which is where the Hanford Nuclear Reservation is located. It's immediately adjacent to Richland, which was the town built to house Hanford workers during World War II. But the Tri-Cities also encompasses Pasco and Kennewick, and everything's situated along the banks of the Columbia River, including the 300,000 acre Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So as I was doing this research, because I thought this was a very intriguing time in history, I started listening to oral testimonies. And after a couple of months of off and on listening to oral testimonies and then beginning a series of really enlightening interviews with experts who had written nonfiction books about Hanford, suddenly I realized there was a story to be told that hadn't been told via a novel. And I was really surprised because there was literally only one other novel out there that had been set on the Hanford Reservation, and it was set during World War II, which my novel is not.
Right.
And
Cold War after.
And it was a very different story. It was like sort of a psychological thriller, and it was more about that person than it really was about
the place.
About the place or the time or the rest of the folks that existed there.
So you got this idea, you started exploring, and then it took you how long to say, I now have it and I am ready to move forward?
So it was in about the 8th month of research, I started penciling out, noodling on characters. And when I came across Tom Bailey, who was one of the very first whistleblowers in the 60s saying, hey, everybody along this mile stretch of farmland, all of these farm families are not just sick, but they have cancer. Like everybody in the family has cancer. Something is wrong, right? And this was after a multitude of other sort of catastrophes that were very suspicious had taken place, and the government had sort of squelched and shushed and denied, et cetera. And but when I came across Tom and his very persistent voice And his very, well, this is why, me and my friends didn't get thyroid cancer. They never drank milk. They only ate processed food, as teenage boys have a tendency to do, right?
Right, right.
And when somebody started mapping what he was saying back to where the most vulnerable or the pathways were for someone to really be exposed to the irradiated elements that were being released into the air, into the Columbia River, into the ground,
Right.
they realized, oh my gosh, he's right.
Yeah, those people who supposedly were healthier.
I read that, right? And when I read that, I thought, oh, wait, this guy actually was credible. Everybody thought, and everybody told him he was nuts. Everybody told him he was crazy.
Right.
I mean, even my friends from Eastern Washington knew of Tom, and had cousins who were pals with him, and they all referred to him as that crazy Tom Bailey. But he was right.
He was
right.
He
was something right was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So I
that
love
gave voice that gave voice to Luke, who is the male protagonist. And what I didn't say earlier is in the book, it's a dual narrative. So Luke is the male protagonist, the voice of the 1963-1964 narrative, which is at the end of the Cold War. And then Mary is the fictitious character who narrates the beginning of the Cold War from about 1947 to 1951.
Right. And I love that we get to see the two perspectives and we're going back and forth. I've always loved a kind of a dual timeline, more than one point of view story. I really enjoyed those. So this really caught me. I think it's interesting that Tangles crosses genres. It's not just one thing or another. You could call it historical fiction because there is, plenty of good, strong historical fiction in there. But it also has a little bit of like the suspense thriller feel, mystery feel to it, right? And then though it doesn't follow the romance trope, it is a love story. Right?
It's a very human.
So it kind of crosses all those. I'm curious, did you have any problems with publishers? Have you had any problems with readers who are like, what genre is this and what are you trying to do? Or has everyone pretty been open to the fact that it crosses these genres?
Well, that's a great question. One of the very first things that happened when I was reaching out to best-selling authors to endorse my book was I was very fortunate to have both Robert Dugoni and Kevin O'Brien, who are marvelous suspense thriller writers of decades, right? And they both read the book early on. And the first thing I heard from Kevin was, wow, what a great environmental thriller. And I was like, what? I wrote an environmental thriller?
I didn't even know that. Yeah.
And then when I heard from Bob Dugoni, he said, this is like an amazing mystery wrapped inside historical fiction, but it really feels a lot like a love story. And I thought, okay. Okay, I've obviously gone across multiple genres, and I think that really has everything to do with the fact that I plotted it in a course with another wonderful author, but he's a young adult novelist, Jean-Claude Bemis, and I plotted the entire novel in one of his plotting courses, and during the course of that, he was very encouraging of all of us that were in the class at the time. He was very encouraging of us to, really take advantage of all of the different aspects of a variety of genres that gave life and heart and pace to a story. And so I think it happened in many ways very organically.
Yeah, I love that. Unlike you, I am a pantser. But like you, I often sit when I'm done with my book and I think, okay, where does this fit?
Right.
Because I don't set out to write a historical fiction or I write this story that's in my head. And then I have to go and say, where does that fit? And mine also often can fit in a few different places. And you're like, well, how do you market that? Like it gets a little scary. But I think that readers are becoming, not all readers, but there seem to be a lot of readers that seem to be less concerned with genre,
I agree.
more concerned with a good story.
Yeah. And I think pace,
Yes.
pace has everything to do with that. And one of the things that I've realized, because I've heard it from multiple trade reviewers now, that my book doesn't feel like the normal historical fiction piece. And Joe Niederhoff at San Francisco Book Review said it feels like so much more.
Yeah.
And I really believe that there is a, a a like a desire for books that even in the historical genre not only are fast paced, but that really evoke a lot more emotion than, say,
Yes.
your typical historical biography of a famous person.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And so it's interesting because I write a lot of historical fiction, but all of my characters are not real. They're made up in my head. The historical setting is real.
Mhm.
And then my characters are like living in that. And so because of that, I can bring up a lot of things that I feel enhance the story because I'm not having to keep completely true to one person's experience.
Right, exactly. And you don't, and I think with fictional characters, what it allows you to do is show, particularly at critical moments in our history, like the nuclear arms race was
Right.
a wildly fearful time for so many across the globe, right? And it allows you to show how every man and every woman kind of existed in that kind of very scary atmosphere, right?
Right.
Kids hiding under their desks because of nuclear bomb drills as if a school desk was going to protect them, and folks building bomb shelters and all of those things. And I think that a lot of that time period has sort of been lost to the current generations. I mean, I've had people in their 50s say, I never really knew about this, because their parents didn't necessarily fight in World War II and didn't necessarily, go to Korea for the police action, right? So a lot of this time period is little known by the majority of Americans living today.
And I think what happens is when we get historical fiction, but it's closer to where we are actually living, like the history books didn't catch up with that.
Right.
Like I was in elementary school and middle school in the 70s.
Right.
And Vietnam was going on. I knew nothing about it.
Right.
Other than the few things maybe you'd hear on the news, and my parents pretty much said news wasn't for kids and you just didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what was going on.
Right.
And then even things like the Korean War, I don't think that was in my history books yet.
Right.
The books that, so I think that's what happens is this history that's history, but it's more modern day history, hasn't really reached the masses. And then nowadays, I'm not even sure what they're teaching in history. So, that's
exactly. Someone, I did a town hall a couple of weeks ago with Joshua Frank, who wrote a wonderful nonfiction book about Hanford, specifically called Atomic Days. And he and I were fielding various questions at the end of the town hall panel. And someone said, what would you suggest in terms of spreading the word about all of the problems environmentally now from, nuclear production, and whether it's for electricity or whether it's for weapons,
whatever.
A huge amount of waste is created that has half-lives of thousands, if not millions of years, right? And my very first response was, we need to rewrite our history books right now to show exactly what happened, which I covered in my book, Tangles, because there are so many things that are within our history now, whether it's forever chemicals and those incidences that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s, not the least of which was the Monsanto debacle, with Formula 47, or the Japanese internment, which was not in the history, which still in many cases is not in the history books, even in Washington State. So there are so many things within this sort of, as you refer to it, modern day history that really needs to be codified in our history books.
Right. And I think what happens is people whitewash it a little bit. They don't want to really look at it,
Right.
And you want to make everything pretty, and you only tell the story you want people to hear. And little by little, then you start to forget. My second book, An Enemy Like Me, talked about the German internment camps during World War II. And the number of people that have reached out to me and said there weren't Germans in internment camps in the United States. And it was like, there were.
Yeah, there were.
There were. It wasn't quite as big as the Japanese internment camps. It was harder to determine who was German. You know what I'm saying? Like, you didn't just look and know. I said, but yeah, there were German internment camps. And so I think it's really interesting when we can find those pieces of history that are getting lost or just pushed under the table that we don't really want to discuss, and then bringing them out.
Yeah. I agree. And I just think it's so important to keep this up. And when any time that I have any kind of a forum, like I was in Park City, Utah last week, and at every single forum that I attended, folks were just blown away. They had no idea the breadth of the damage to the environment that nuclear production has. And with the current conversation around nuclear energy and the false narrative that it's green, I mean, it's like, wait a minute, hang on.
Wait. Whoa.
Whoa.
Yeah, like we need to look at the whole picture and find out what's really going on. No, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
And like I said, whether you're processing for a weapon, which includes plutonium, or whether you're simply processing for electricity, which is mainly uranium being processed, both of those production cycles create a huge amount of nuclear waste, radioactive elements going into air, water, and ground that cannot, and this isn't something you can just sweep up with a broom.
Exactly. So let's get back to your research just for a minute. How it had to have been, there's a lot. There's probably way more research that you did than you could possibly fit into the book. I mean, I know that's the way I do. I research, and then you have to pick.
Right.
How careful were you to try to make these details as accurate as possible so that people would understand what really was happening there?
Very. I mean, I took very specific things. For instance, the spike in children's leukemia that occurred in the early 50s. I took very specific things and wove them into Mary's story or Luke's story in a very intentional way. So the scene around the Green Run, which was an actual operation that the Air Force ran in conjunction with the scientists at Hanford, that is set on the exact day at the exact time that it happened. My scene is fictional.
Right. But you tried to keep everything else is accurate. Yeah.
Right. So every event, every occurrence of whether it's illness or a lamb being born deformed, all of that happened. And usually within, if not the exact day, within the same month that it actually happened in real time.
Right. I think you and I have a very similar feel for how historical fiction needs to be done. I feel like the history part needs to be as accurate as a person can make it. My characters that are made up can do within that scene what they want, as long as it makes sense for the history of the time.
Right.
So my characters have a lot more leeway, but the actual happenings, I'm not going to change something.
Right.
Every now and then maybe take a little bit of license and put two things together in one day instead of making them a week apart or something. But in general, these things happened as I'm saying they happened. And now here's my fictitious character here to explain it all to you.
Exactly. Exactly. And I did the same thing. It was interesting. I heard from a gal who runs some walking tours in Richland, and she's a good good friend of another gal whose book club I met with last week. And I said, I'd love to visit with her, because she had read my book and enjoyed the book. And when she shot me an email yesterday morning, she said, there really was no auditorium in Richland. And I actually knew that. But what I did in my very first scene in the prologue is I took, when they built the workers' camp that was torn down after World War II was over, and they more or less stopped building as much on the campus at Hanford. They built a huge cafeteria slash auditorium hall. So during the day, it was filled with tables, and huge pine rafters went up to the ceiling. But at night, they shoved the tables around and they had dances. And I took, a little bit of liberty with that to show an all town dance.
Right.
But she's right. In fact, the only auditorium in town would have been the Richland High School at the time. But that wasn't the atmosphere I wanted for that scene.
Exactly.
So, you take a little poetic license here or there.
But something like that is so small that it isn't going to affect the actual outcome one way or the other. So you definitely weren't talking about deformed lambs that didn't exist. That was too real to your story.
Right.
I'm just curious on a personal level whether you are following up the current cleanup efforts and things that are still ongoing in that area.
Yes. In fact, all the pre-orders of my book, which I'm very pleased to say were quite good.
Fantastic.
The royalties for every book that was sold before my publication date was donated to Heart of America Northwest, which is the advocacy group that not only forced the protocols around the cleanup to be codified into what's called the Tri-State Agreement. So it's a legal document, legislated and codified with both the federal government and the Washington state government. But they also continue to monitor the cleanup, to hold the Department of Energy's feet to the fire on certain protocols, and to report out to the public. So if folks want to know more, Hanford Cleanup, all one word, hanfordcleanup.org, O-R-G.
Fantastic. I figured that you were paying attention. Like I said, I'm a research junkie, and so I'm looking up Hanford, and it's like, I didn't know this. I didn't know
there were 56 million gallons of nuclear waste hanging out in Eastern Washington.
And then it was like, so then I'm typing in more like, when was the cleanup? And it's like, it's currently happening. There are still people living with this. Like,
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Hanford's 3 Superfund sites, and I don't know if you have an idea about a Superfund site, but they are big. And Hanford has 3 of them within the reservation property.
That is crazy. Yep. So there were a lot of plot twists and turns, which I love. So I'm curious, are you a plotter or are you a pantser?
So I started out with my first manuscript being a pantser. I very quickly realized that wasn't probably the best way to write a story, particularly when it spanned a lot of years. So then in my second manuscript, I got a little bit better at it. I outlined certain things. It was, again, a dual narrative, and I'm actually reworking it right now into a first person narrative for both characters. And I got a little bit better at outlining. But again, going back to this great plotting course I took with Jean-Claude Bemis, I have now become a serious plotter.
Well, maybe that's what I need then is a serious course, because I am such a pantser. I've tried plotting on my own, and I back myself into corners and don't even feel like I can write. And it's like, I don't know. I think I am so firmly a pantser. I don't know that I will ever figure out this whole plotting thing. So,
well, I would say so. Jean-Claude Bemis has an 8 boxes that create your storyline or create your plot, right? And within those boxes, there's a lot of flexibility. Like you can think, oh, wait, no, this I really want towards the end of the story now. And so what he's done is he's developed these boxes to be sure that you have certain things happening in your storyline, that they are coming along where they're needed in the plot, so you don't have that saggy middle. But so you do punish the protagonist enough times that everybody really, really is rooting for them, right? So yeah. So he actually has given you that flexibility so that you don't kind of work yourself into a corner. It's really a great system, and I'm happy to share.
Yeah, I would love to learn a little more about it, because I've tried a few things that have not worked for me. I tried what's the one about the cat?
Save the cat.
Save it. Worked myself right into a corner, and then it was like, now what am I going to do? And yeah, I don't know. My brain it works. I don't know how it works. I think that's the really scary thing, is it just goes and does its own thing and whatever. So Kay, what are you working on now?
So I'm working on two things. I'm working on rewriting my second manuscript, which I think is a terrific story. It's the background of it, or the premise of it, is the amount of redlining that went on in Dallas, Texas. But it's about two different women that come together. One of them, an iconic female judge that was appointed to a special Texas State Supreme Court. And she's real, actually. But there's very little known about her later years, because she closed her practice in her late 60s to take care of her chronically ill sister. And so I have imagined the last 6 to 8 years of her life. And how she might respond to the civil rights movement in Dallas, Texas.
Oh, I love that. That sounds really good.
Yeah, so I'm reworking. And then I'm also working on a story. Again, the premise is the Texas state highway system and the graft and the corruption that went along with land grabs. And part of that was, at the same time, they were doing what's called the Highland Lakes and the damming system. The Lower Colorado River Authority was damming lakes. And there was an awful lot of land grabs, an awful lot of money made. And that's kind of the backdrop for my mother's story. She taught in rural Texas with 5 gals who became dear friends and who were my kissing aunties all my life. Yeah. So it's kind of telling their story, but against the backdrop of all of that progress happening. And it also has a murder.
because you don't ever stay in one genre.
Yeah, exactly. It also has a murder. And my second manuscript that I'm reworking has a terrific senior romance and young love. Yeah, it's got it all.
Yeah. I love that. I tell people all the time, I don't like to be put in a box. And I feel like when you're writing a specific genre and that's what people want to put you into, it feels very constricting to me. And so I'm currently writing a contemporary humor piece, which is so totally different than anything I've done before. But the character was in my head and I thought, well, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it. So it's about a woman going through menopause, and it's very tongue-in-cheek and funny. But while I'm doing it, I also want to shed the light on medical bias and how women are often, essentially patted on the head and told, don't be so hormonal and, take 2 Tylenol and get out of my office.
And that was, I feel you, because that was a big impetus for me with Tangles, is I really wanted to debunk a lot of the tropes about the Ozzie and Harriet life of the 50s and the 60s, and that women were still so restricted. And the fact that Mary, I mean, it's no secret because it comes up in the prologue, suffered spousal abuse. And that was very common. And people, including the police, didn't want to get involved in, quote, family matters, even though it was violence against women. And so debunking a lot of those tropes and showing, again, where we came from. Again, I feel like a lot of the generations, particularly of women today, that they don't necessarily have a deep understanding of how recently women were restricted in many ways.
My mother is 82. When she got married, so she got married in 62.
Right.
She wasn't even allowed to have a credit card.
Exactly. And she probably couldn't withdraw from their joint checking account without her husband's signature.
Right. And she told me the first house that they owned, she was not a signature on the loan,
on the
because women weren't.
Right.
And I'm like, I mean, I was born in 63, so this happened in my lifetime.
Yes, it did.
Now, by the time I was aware and mom had a credit card but she started out her marriage essentially as her husband's wife, period.
Exactly.
And luckily I had a great dad who would have never denied mom that, but he could have denied her access to their money. He could have denied her the ability to go shop when she needed to. He could have done all of that, and it would have been seen as totally normal.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think those aspects of our history are particularly prescient now.
Yeah.
I just feel like there are so many conversations across the globe that need to be informed by this history. And so that's something I'm very passionate on doing.
About. Yeah. Fantastic. So, hey guys, if you want to keep this conversation going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you're going to have the chance to win a free digital copy of Kay's book, Tangles. So head on over there today. Kay, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, talk with you about Tangles, about other things that you're writing, about what you learned about the Hanford whole debacle, how do they do that? How do they get up with you?
Easiest way is just head to my website, sign up for my newsletter, and there's a way to contact me directly. But I believe my email is literally on my homepage of my website. So Kay Smith-Blum.com. Smith-Blum.com.
Super. And I'll have that in the show notes, guys. So run right out and grab Tangles. It is a fabulous first book. I'm really award winning. Yeah, it's really good. It had me from the beginning. I read it so quickly. So definitely run right out and grab the book. And Kay, thank you so much for being with me today.
I so appreciate you having me, Terry. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.